Manitoba. Say the name and most people picture the same three things. Polar bears padding down the streets of Churchill like white dogs wandered in from the sea, an ocean of flat prairie rolling to a horizon that never arrives, and hockey played outdoors in a cold so vicious it can crack steel and freeze a man's breath before it clears his lips. Wheat, winter, and wildlife. That is the postcard. But there is another Manitoba nobody films, where the prairie gives out and the rock and muskeg begin, where whole towns were conjured out of nickel and copper and one thin railway, and where you can buy a house for $15,000 and still not find one soul willing to take it. Welcome to the empty north. Go on, subscribe, and let's start. Number 1. Thompson, the nickel city that keeps subtracting. Thompson sits roughly 740 kilometers north of Winnipeg, the largest city in the Manitoba North, and, for a long stretch, the proudest. It was not born the way most towns are born, slowly and by accident along a river or a crossing. It was designed. In the 1950s, the company then known as Inco found one of the richest nickel deposits on the continent buried under the muskeg, and in 1956, they simply built a city on top of it, naming the place after the company chairman, John Fairfield Thompson. At its peak, Thompson held over 19,000 people and called itself the hub of the North with a straight face. Today, it is closer to 12 or 13,000, and it loses a little more with every census. The reason it shrinks is the very same reason it exists, the mine. Inco became Vale, and Vale eventually did the arithmetic that every mining company does. In 2018, they shut the smelter and the refinery, the two operations that turned Thompson's raw ore into finished metal, and cut hundreds of jobs in a single morning's announcement. What remains is mining and milling, and even that lives under a permanent question mark, with the owner openly floating a sail and studying exactly how many years of ore are truly left down in the dark. Homes in Thompson can be found for $60,000 to $130,000, cheap by the standard of any southern city, and older units in town change hands for far less, $20,000 or $30,000 for something that still has a furnace fighting the winter. And the furnace matters here more than any granite countertop, because Thompson gets cold in a way that punishes every shortcut a builder ever took. Carl said a city built on a single mine sounded like a stool built on a single leg. I told him it worked perfectly well as long as nobody sat down, and then I reminded him that 150 years of mining history is really just the long story of everybody, eventually, sitting down. Number 2. Flin Flon, the town named after a dime novel that outlived its own mine. Flin Flon is one of the stranger places in the country before you even reach the economics of it. It straddles the border between Manitoba and Saskatchewan, so a man can stand in his kitchen in one province and brush his teeth in another, and it takes its name from Josiah Flintabete Floniton, the hero of a forgotten pulp paperback a prospector happened to be reading when he staked the claim in 1915. On that whimsy, a real city rose, copper and zinc pulled out of the ground by the company that became Hudbay, with a population that once pushed past 10,000 souls. Today, it holds around 5,000, and the number that defines the place now is a closing date. The smelter went dark back in 2010. Then, in June of 2022, the last operating mine, the one they called 777, wrapped up after 18 years of steady production, and with it went the reason the whole town was ever poured onto that rock. Homes in Flin Flon list for $30,000 to $110,000, and plenty of solid little houses sit on the market well under $50,000, waiting on buyers who are increasingly theoretical. It is a handsome town, honestly, carved into the Precambrian shield with streets that climb and twist because dynamite decided where they would go, and its people are fiercely, almost defiantly attached to it. But a mining town without a working mine is a body still warm, running on hospital jobs, the school, a smaller sister mine near Snow Lake, and the stubborn refusal of the people who stayed to admit that the party is over. Carl looked at a photo of one of those cheap houses and said it looked perfectly livable. I told him it was, that livable was never the problem, and that the problem was the 400 kilometers of spruce and rock between that livable house and any job worth driving to. Number 3. Snow Lake, the gold town holding its breath. Snow Lake sits east of Flin Flon, a small community of somewhere around 1,000 people tucked into the same ancient greenstone belt that made its neighbors rich and then abandoned them. For a long time, Snow Lake was a modest mining settlement like a dozen others, going up and down with the price of metal, and by the early 2000s, most people had written it into the same obituary column as the rest of the North. Then the arithmetic flipped, for once. in the town's favor. Hudbay developed the Lalor deposit nearby, a genuine gold and base metal mine, and refurbished a mill to feed it. And suddenly Snow Lake had something almost nobody else up here has, which is a mine that is still opening rather than closing. That is why I put it here, in the middle of a list of the emptying, as the exception that explains the rule. Because even with a working mine, even with steady paychecks, and a future measured in real years, Snow Lake is not booming the way you would expect. Homes still sell for $30,000 to $90,000, the school still fights for enrollment, and young families still weigh the wage against the isolation, and often choose the isolation of somewhere warmer and closer to a hospital. The lesson of Snow Lake is a quiet and uncomfortable one. In the north, even winning is precarious. A mine can extend its life by a decade, and the town around it still cannot quite believe in a future, because everyone up there has watched what happens on the day the ore runs out, and they have all agreed, without ever saying it aloud, to keep one bag packed. Carl said that sounded ungrateful, a town with a working mine that still would not relax. I told him it was not ungratefulness, it was memory, and that a man who has been burned learns to hold even a warm stove at arm's length, which is exactly how the whole North has learned to hold a good year. Number 4. Lynn Lake, the town that packed itself up and physically moved. This one I love, in the way you love a story that is also a warning. Lynn Lake sits far up in the northwest of the province, near the end of the road, and it did not simply grow there, it was hauled there. In the late 1940s, the Sherritt-Gordon Company found nickel at Lynn Lake, but had a perfectly good town already built at a place called Sheridan, 150 miles to the south, where its old mine was playing out. So rather than build twice, they moved the town. Over 2 brutal winters they loaded houses, the hospital, the store, the church, whole buildings, onto sleds and dragged them across frozen lakes and muskeg by tractor train to the new site. An entire community relocated across the wilderness, building by building, on the ice. Lynn Lake grew to 2,000 or 3,000 people on that nickel, and later on gold, and for a while it worked. Then the nickel mine closed in the middle 1970s, and the gold operations that followed eventually closed too, and the town that had traveled so far to live began, slowly, to die. Today, fewer than 500 people remain. Homes here are among the cheapest in Canada, listing for $10,000 or $15,000 or $20,000, and even at that price they linger, because a house is only worth the paycheck within driving distance of it, and here there is none. Carl heard the moving story and said it was remarkable that they carried an entire town across the ice. I told him the truly remarkable part was that they went to all that trouble, and half a century later the town they saved is nearly as empty as the one they left. Number 5. Sheridan, the place Lynn Lake left behind. You cannot tell the story of Lynn Lake without turning around and looking at the hole it climbed out of. Sheridan is that hole. It was a Sherritt-Gordon Company town too, copper and zinc, and in its day it had a proper population, a railway connection, a school, all the ordinary machinery of a living place. Then the ore thinned. The company decided its future lay north at Lynn Lake, and Sheridan was, in the most literal sense, dismantled and carried away. What was left behind never recovered. Today, Sheridan is a near ghost, a scattering of cabins, and a small number of year-round residents, mostly reached by a rough road or the rail line, sitting beside the tailings of a mine that stopped mattering the better part of a century ago. There are almost no house prices to quote here, because there is barely a market, only the occasional cabin changing hands between people who want quiet, and fishing more than they want work. And that is exactly why Sheridan belongs on this list, low down where the truly finished places sit. It is the North's honest ending shown in advance. Thompson worries about becoming Flin Flon. Flin Flon worries about becoming Lynn Lake, and Lynn Lake, if it lets itself, worries about becoming Sheridan, a name on an old map, a few chimneys in the bush, and the memory of a town that was worth so much that they physically stole it and rebuilt it somewhere else. Number 6. Leaf Rapids, the town of the future that ran out of future. Leaf Rapids is the saddest kind of northern town, because it was not an accident, and it was not a leftover from a rougher century. It was a plan. In 1971, the province and the Sherritt-Gordon Company built Leaf Rapids from nothing to serve the Rutan copper and zinc mine, and they built it as a showpiece, a modern resource town done properly, with the environment and the people thought through in advance. Its crown jewel was the town center, a single enclosed building that held the stores, the school, the library, the government offices, and more, all under one roof, so residents never had to step into a 40-below winter to run their errands. It was one of the first buildings of its kind in Canada, genuinely ahead of its time. The town grew to something over 2,000 people. Then the Rutten mine closed in 2002, and the future the planners had engineered so carefully simply stopped arriving. Today, Leaf Rapids has a few hundred residents. The town has spent time under provincial administration because it could no longer manage its own finances, and that famous enclosed town center stands mostly empty, a shining mall built for a crowd that left. Homes list for $10,000 to $30,000 and move slowly. Carl asked what happened to the wonderful indoor mall. I told him it was still standing, still warm in parts, still remarkable, and almost entirely empty, which is somehow more haunting than any collapsing building, because a ruin at least admits what it is, while an empty mall keeps the lights on and pretends the customers are just running late. Subscribe to show me that these videos actually help and actually make sense. Number 7. Churchill, the town at the end of the line, and I mean that literally. Churchill sits on the shore of Hudson Bay, at the far northeastern edge of the province, and it is the most famous place on this entire list, the polar bear capital of the world, where tourists pay handsomely to ride out in armored buggies and watch the great white bears wait for the ice to form. Around 900 people live there year-round, and here is the fact that governs everything else about Churchill. There is no road. You cannot drive to Churchill. You get there by air, which is expensive, or by rail, which is slow, and that is the whole list. The town depends utterly on the Hudson Bay Railway, that thin steel thread running up through the muskeg, for food, fuel, building supplies, everything a community needs to survive a subarctic winter. In May of 2017, the spring flooding washed the line out in dozens of places, and the railway's owner declared it beyond economic repair. For roughly 18 months, Churchill had no rail link at all. The cost of everything, already high, went vertical, with fresh food flown in at prices that would stop your heart faster than the cold. Groceries that cost a few dollars in Winnipeg cost triple or more on that shelf. The line was finally repaired and reopened late in 2018 after government stepped in, but the town had been shown, in the plainest possible terms, exactly how thin the thread it hangs by really is. Homes in Churchill are scarce and oddly priced, because the tourism draw props up demand even as isolation strangles supply, but the deeper truth sits underneath the polar bears and the postcards. This is a place where a single washed-out culvert can cut an entire town off from the country for a year and a half, and no amount of charm on a tour brochure changes that arithmetic. Number 8. Gillam, the town the dams built and mostly forgot. Gillam sits in the northeast, on the lower Nelson River, and unlike almost every other town on this list, it was not raised on ore. It was raised on water, and specifically on the enormous hydroelectric dams that Manitoba Hydro strung along the Nelson, the Kettle, Long Spruce, and Limestone generating stations, and more recently the Kiosk project, built in partnership with local First Nations. For decades, Gillam was a hydro town, a place of construction crews and operators and their families, its population swelling when a dam was being built and settling back down when the concrete was poured and the turbines were spinning. It sits at roughly 1,000 people, give or take with the projects. And that is the peculiar trap of a dam town. The construction phase employs thousands and feels like a boom that will never end, and then the dam is finished, and a finished dam needs only a small crew to run it. The jobs that built the town do not stay to live in it. Homes in Gillam are largely tied to Hydro's own housing and to a modest local market, and they are cheap by any national measure. But ownership means little when your entire reason for being there can be reassigned to the next river with a memo. The railway to Churchill runs through Gillam, which gives it a lifeline the pure mining towns lack. But Gillam illustrates the same law by a different route. Whether the resource is nickel under the rock or force in a falling river, the North builds a town to extract it, and when the extracting is done, the town is left standing there, holding an asset the world no longer needs on site. And there is a harder chapter here too, because the same dams that made Gillam flooded the traditional lands of the Cree, who were there long before Manitoba Hydro drew a single line on a map, drowning trap lines and burial grounds, and altering the river forever, so that the story of Gillam is not only a story about jobs coming and going, but about who paid the real price for the electricity that lights the cities far to the south, and whether that debt was ever honestly settled. Number 9. The Pass, where the mill smoke thinned out. The Pass is one of the oldest settlements in the whole region, a genuine historic crossroads on the Saskatchewan River, rather than a mid-century company invention, sitting across the water from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, with a long, tangled, shared history. Around 5,000 people live in the town itself, For generations, its economy leaned hard on the forest, on a big sawmill and paper operation that gave the place a solid industrial spine and a payroll that fed the surrounding countryside. Then the forestry business did what resource businesses do. In 2016, Tolko announced it was closing its operations at the pass, threatening hundreds of jobs and gutting the confidence of the community, until the paper side was bought and kept running under new ownership, saving a portion of the work, but not the old certainty. A town that once assumed the mill would run forever, now watches every quarterly report the way farmers watch the sky. Homes in the pass sell for $40,000 to $120,000, more of a real market than the tiny outposts up the line, because the pass is a service hub, with a hospital, a college, and stores that draw shoppers from a wide, thinly populated hinterland. Carl said at least the pass had a hospital and a college, so it sounded like it would be fine. I told him fine was a strong word for a town whose whole identity had spent a decade balanced on whether a single mill would keep its doors open, and that a place can have a hospital, a college, and a slow leak in its population, all at the very same time. Number 10. Cranberry Portage, the crossroads, with nowhere left to cross to. Cranberry Portage lies on the road and rail between the pass and Flin Flon, a small community of a few hundred people that exists, as its name honestly admits, because it was a portage, a carrying place, a spot where people moving through the country had to stop and shift their loads. That was its purpose for a very long time, a way station, a link in a chain of movement between bigger places. It found a modern reason to exist as well, as a service and residential point for the mining traffic rumbling between the towns, and it is known regionally for a residential school and later a training academy that brought young people through. But a way station only matters as long as there is meaningful traffic to serve, and as the mines up the line wind down and the population of the whole north contracts, the reasons to pass through Cranberry Portage thin out along with everything else. Homes here run cheap, in the tens of thousands, some cabins and modest houses moving for less, often bought by people chasing the lakes and the fishing rather than any job. It is a pleasant place, genuinely, sitting among good water. But pleasant is not the same as viable, and a town whose founding logic was that travelers had to stop there is in real trouble in a country where the travelers are increasingly staying home in the south, and where the loads they once carried through no longer need carrying at all. Carl said a lakeside cabin for the price of a used truck sounded like the deal of a lifetime. I told him it was, right up until the morning he needed a doctor, or a job, or a grocery store that stocked more than the essentials, and then the 200 kilometers of bush between him and any of those things would turn the deal of a lifetime into the longest commute of his life. Number 11. Wabowden, a name on a timetable. Wabowden is a small community of a few hundred people south of Thompson, and to understand it you have to understand the thing it sits on, the Hudson Bay Railway, that long single track running north from the pass up toward Thompson, Gillam, and finally Churchill on the bay. Wabowden exists because the railway needed places along its length, points where trains stopped, where crews changed, where the country could be reached and worked. Its very name is a memorial to the railway, cobbled together from the initials of a railway official, which tells you exactly what gave the place its life. For as long as the line was busy, and the north was filling up, a town like Wabowden had a role, but the railway that made it is itself a fragile thing now, running through country that is emptying out, carrying fewer people to fewer working places. Homes in Wabowden are cheap, in the low tens of thousands, and the community leans on the school, on local services, and on the surrounding land and lakes for the trapping and fishing that predate every railway and every mine. That older economy, the land itself, is the quiet backbone that keeps many of these small northern places breathing at all. But a town whose modern purpose was to serve a railway is in a difficult spot when the railway's own future is a subject of government studies and rescue funding, because the thread that gave it life is the same thread now visibly fraying. Number 12. Piquitone and Thicket Portage, the flag stops. Now we get down to the truly small, the places where the word town starts to feel too grand. Piquitone and Thicket Portage are tiny communities strung along that same Hudson Bay Railway between Thompson and the south, and they share a defining feature that tells you everything. They are flag stops. The train does not automatically halt there. You stand beside the track and you flag it down, and if you want off, you tell the crew, and the great machine slows for you and then rolls on. Each holds only a small number of residents, many of them indigenous, living in country where the railway is not a convenience, but the main artery to the outside world. since the all-weather road does not reach every one of these points, and the winter roads that do are seasonal and treacherous. There is barely a housing market to speak of. Homes are few, changed hands rarely, valued in the low thousands when they are valued at all, because you cannot build a market where there are almost no buyers and almost no jobs to draw them. What these places have instead of an economy is a way of life, generations of families who know the land, who trap and fish and hunt and endure, and who stay not because the spreadsheet says to, but because it is home, and their people are buried there. To measure Piquitone by house prices is to miss it entirely. It was never trying to be a market. It was trying to be a home along a railway, and the railway is the only reason it can still be reached at all. Number 13. Cormorant, Ilford, and the communities the map barely admits. Out at the far thin edge of this network sit places most Manitobans could not find on a map and have certainly never visited. Cormorant, a small community with a large indigenous population, near the rail line north of the pass. Ilford, tinier still, far up toward the bay, once a transfer point where the branch line ran off toward the fly-in community of God's Lake and beyond, now a handful of people at the end of a very long thread. And beyond even the rail sit the fly-in and part-road communities of the true north, the Cree and Ojibwe nations like Cross Lake, which is Pimicikamak, and Norway House, large and living communities with their own governments, their own languages, their own deep histories that run back long before any prospector read a pulp novel and staked a claim. I want to be careful and plain here, because these places are not dying mining towns, and it would be a lie and an insult to file them under the same collapse. They face isolation, and a savage cost of living where everything trucked or flown in costs double or triple, and housing shortages rather than empty houses, and all the hard weight of remoteness. But they are growing where the company towns are shrinking, holding their young people where the mining towns lose theirs, because their reason to exist was never a mineral price on a distant exchange. Their reason to exist is that they are home, and always were, and a home does not close when the ore runs out. That distinction is the most important one in this whole list, and I will not blur it. Number 14. The wider northern crisis. Step back from any single town and look at the whole top half of the province at once, and the pattern stops being a collection of sad individual stories and becomes one large, structural thing. Northern Manitoba covers an enormous territory, the great majority of the province's land, and holds only a small fraction of its people, a scattering of communities separated by hundreds of kilometers of rock, spruce, muskeg, and water, connected by a road network that is thin and incomplete, and a single railway that is fragile and aging. The economy of this whole vastness was built, almost entirely, on pulling things out of the ground and out of the rivers. Nickel at Thompson, copper and zinc at Flin Flon, Lynn Lake and Leaf Rapids, gold where they could find it, timber at the pass, electricity from the dams on the Nelson, and every one of those industries follows the same merciless curve. Discovery, boom, a town raised in a hurry, a generation or two of good wages, and then depletion or automation, or a shift in a global market that no one in the town can see coming or do anything about, followed by decline. The mines close, or shrink, or get sold to owners who run them with a fraction of the workers. The mill closes or nearly does. The dam gets built and then needs almost nobody to run it, and the towns that were poured onto the land specifically to serve those operations are left standing with no second act, because they were never designed to have one. There was never a plan B. Add to that the things that make the North. The cold, which is not a metaphor but a budget line, driving the cost of heating and building, and simply staying alive far above anything the South understands. The distance, which turns every trip to a specialist, every load of groceries, every gallon of fuel, into an expensive expedition. And the isolation, which means that when a young person leaves for school or work in Winnipeg, the pull keeping them there is enormous, and the pull bringing them back is a cheap house in a town with no job. Multiply that decision across a whole generation, and you do not get a crisis in any one place. You get the slow, quiet emptying of half a province. Number 15. The big picture, why the North stays empty. So let me pull it all together, the way I always do at the end, and try to say the honest thing. Manitoba as a whole is not emptying out. The province is growing, steadily, healthily. But look closely, and nearly all of that growth is happening in one place, in Winnipeg, and its spreading suburbs down in the warm, flat, connected South, where the highways meet, and the airport hums, and the jobs actually are. The North is a different country wearing the same provincial flag, and the reasons it stays empty are structural, stubborn, and mostly beyond the reach of any single town's effort or hope. First, the jobs. The whole northern economy was built to extract, and extraction is a business with an ending built into it from the first day. A mine has only so much ore, a forest supports only so many mills before the economics turn, and when the reason a town exists is used up, no new reason politely arrives to take its place, because remote northern towns are the last places on any company's list for a factory, a head office, or a warehouse. Second, the distance and the cost. Everything up north costs more, because everything has to travel, by that long, fragile railway, or by air, or over ice roads that exist for only a few weeks of the deepest winter. Food costs more, fuel costs more. Building a house costs more, and insuring it and heating it costs more still, so that a house priced at $15,000 can quietly cost more to keep alive each year than the house is worth. Third, the infrastructure, which is thin where it exists and simply absent where it does not. Many communities have no all-weather road at all, tied to the rest of the country by a single rail line or by winter roads that a warming climate makes shorter and less reliable every single year. When the link is that fragile, one washout, one bad thaw, and a town is cut off, exactly as Churchill was cut off for 18 months by a single spring flood. Fourth, healthcare and services, which shrink as the population shrinks, so that a smaller town has a smaller clinic, fewer doctors, longer flights out for anything serious, which in turn frightens away the very families who might have stayed and stabilized the place. And so the circle closes, the same way it always closes. The mine or the mill winds down. The jobs go. The young people follow the jobs south. The population falls, so the school shrinks and the clinic shrinks and the store struggles, which makes the town less livable, which drives out more people, which shrinks the tax base and the services further, which empties another street of houses, which drops the prices to 15,000, then 10, then to a number nobody will pay for a place with no work, no doctor, and no way out that does not depend on a railway the country keeps threatening to abandon. It is a death spiral measured in decades rather than years, quiet enough that the rest of the province barely notices, but for the towns caught inside it, the direction of travel is not in any real doubt. None of this means the North is without worth or without beauty, and it would be a poor old man who left you thinking so. The land up there is staggering, an ancient country of black rock and endless water, and northern lights burning green across a sky with no city glow to spoil it, of caribou and white bears and rivers that have never been dammed and never will be. And the people are the toughest and most rooted I know of anywhere, miners and railwaymen, and above all the indigenous nations, who were on that land for thousands of years before the first shaft was ever sunk, and who will be there long after the last one closes. They do not want your pity, and they would be right to resent it. They want jobs that outlast a single deposit, a railway the country will actually commit to keeping, roads and clinics and schools, and the plain recognition that they belong to the same province that pours its money and its pride into the bright growing South. But investment follows people, and people follow work, and work follows infrastructure, and infrastructure follows a tax base, and a tax base needs people, and so the North stays locked inside that closing circle, watching the houses go quiet, and the prices fall, and the trains run a little less often, waiting for a second act that the arithmetic keeps refusing to write. I am an old man, and old men worry, mostly about the places that everyone else has agreed to stop thinking about. Carl told me there was no point fretting over a few empty towns at the top of a map nobody looks at anyway. I told him that was precisely the point, that the places nobody looks at are the places that get left to freeze, and that a country is best judged not by the cities it lights up, but by the far towns it lets go dark. Take care of yourself.